Have you ever heard of someone taking mushrooms and then turning into someone you no longer recognize? It sounds like the kind of headline you scroll past at 2 a.m. The kind of thing you shake your head at and say, "That's awful." But the truth is worse, because it really happened. This is the story of Thomas, a young man, 19, built like a rugby player, who came home for winter break and walked straight into a night that would unravel the lives of everyone who loved him. Thomas was, by many accounts, a good kid. He'd been on a rugby team in high school, and the sport had left its marks on his body and mind. A sullen cheerfulness here, a sudden quiet there, and a string of concussions no one knew how to read until later. He was at that age of being both fully grown and still so very young, filling out, testing limits, bouncing between the safety of home and the freedom of college life. He had friends from high school, guys he trusted. They laughed at the same jokes, drank the same beers, and like so many people do when they're bored and restless, they wanted something different one night. The night began simple enough. A group of friends met at a local sports bar, the kind of place where the booths are sticky with old spilled soda and the TVs are always tuned to a game. They drank and watched hockey, and swapped stories about classes and mutual acquaintances. Conversation was loose and easy, until someone who always had ideas and the nerve to act on them, suggested they pool money and buy mushrooms. "Let's do them at Thomas's," he said, the way a man suggests grabbing pizza. Everyone agreed. It felt like something safe, something to pass the hours, a cheap thrill on a slow winter night. They hit a dealer they knew, bought the bag, and later piled into the familiar chaos of Thomas's mom's basement. Basements are funny places for revelry. Emerized posters, couches that have seen better days, the hum of the furnace. The friends sat in a circle, passing the bag, laughing at nothing, easing into the ritual of it. They each took a dose from the bag. They ate, they joked, they settled in to wait for the world to tilt. The mushrooms began to work on most of them. The room softened, voices stretched, laughter came alive in a new way. But Thomas remained oddly still. He sat watching the rest of the group float away, and a small anxiety crawled across his face. He was a big young man with a big body, and he assumed he needed more to feel it. So he reached into the bag again and took more, a handful. Then he waited. When the effects finally caught him, they came in a rush. For a while it was okay, the kind of euphoria that makes time elastic, the kind of connection that turns mundane jokes into something cosmic. The friends left the basement at some point to walk, to clear their heads, to feel the air. They played video games. They trailed in and out of conversation. The night had that sticky, timeless quality people remember after the fact, by the way they can still smell the air. But in the early hours, around 2 a.m, the mood shifted. Thomas changed. The first signs were small: agitation, a shorthand language slipping into fragments. He grew increasingly agitated, a tightness forming in his jaw. The friends, still under the influence themselves, noticed but maybe didn't fully register how bad it would get. Thomas began to speak in a way none of them recognized, a terrified, urgent cadence where sentences broke into nonsense, where meaning dissolved into sounds. He became paranoid. He told them he was scared. He bolted up the stairs. He ran into his mother's bedroom, lit the light without thinking about who might be sleeping there, and simply sat on the floor as his mother and her boyfriend, Essie, teared in the bed beside him. She was startled. She was tired. She asked him to turn the light off. He didn't. There are small details that bury themselves in the memory of witnesses. The sound of the mattress springs, the private shame of being awake at 3 a.m., the thin thread of embarrassment that rises when your adult child acts like a child who can't be soothed. In this case, the mother rose quickly, annoyed, and slipped out of bed to click the switch. She was naked. It wasn't until that moment that she realized he might be seeing things. If a grown son is unimpressed by the sight of his mother naked when he used to be comfortably mortified, there's a new wrongness in the world. She followed him back downstairs. The commotion brought his sister out of her room. Voices rose. Insults began to stitch themselves into the air. At some point, Thomas started to see his family differently, not as the people they were, but as something else entirely. He called his mother and sister demons and Satan. He used his phone's flashlight like a weapon, as if a beam of light might expose the evil he believed he saw. His mother and sister tried to talk him down. The friends tried to intervene, but by then the mushrooms, something deep in his past brain injuries, and a fragile filter between perception and reality, had braided into catastrophe. He said he was going to his dad's house. The two parents were divorced, and the father lived only a block away. The family tried to block the door. They tried to hold him. He shoved them aside without much effort. Thomas was not gentle. He was a big teenager who had been taught to be hard by years of playing a rough sport. He sprinted into the night barefoot, shirtless, and the December air in Canada took the breath from his lungs like a physical thing. It was a portrait of adolescence and something more dangerous. The sudden, sharp unraveling of a person who had been carrying cracks no one could see. Someone, a friend, startled and semi-dazed, jumped in a car with Thomas's mother and the mother's boyfriend and drove the minute down the block to the father's place, their headlights cut through snow flurries. When they pulled onto the street, they saw a figure outside a neighbor's house. Thomas. He was ranting, animated and wild, as if the world was a stage for a delusion. One friend climbed out, offered a jacket, and tried to talk to him. But Thomas escalated. He declared himself something he was not. "I am God! No one can stop me!" he shouted. And from there it got stranger and scarier. When the friend retreated to the car, Thomas followed. He picked up a rock and smashed it repeatedly into the driver's side window. The sound of glass giving way in the cold night was the moment the evening shifted off the map. People who are high on mushrooms do strange, reckless things. But those acts rarely involve sustained violence. In this instance, the window broke, and the friends panicked. Nobody had a phone. They'd left in a hurry, leaving everything behind in the basement. The group drove back the way they'd come, and Thomas, still impulsive, ran to his father's house on foot. At about 3 a.m, he found an unlocked window and climbed into the house. There's an old, common thought. Your childhood home is a place that remembers you. For Thomas that night, the house kept the memory of him as a boy, until he kicked down the bedroom door and declared a day of reckoning. He believed in that moment he was on a mission, acting out a delusion, seeing monsters where ordinary people slept. His father awoke startled. In the confused dawn of the fight, the father tried to subdue his son. That attempt to physically restrain a nearly grown man who had been hardened by rugby was perhaps doomed from the beginning. Thomas was strong and frantic. He was in the grip of something that muted reason. When he grabbed a kitchen knife, the scene broke into an even darker register. He stabbed his father again and again until the man could not recover. All of the above, the panic, the screaming, the desperate calls, happened in a few rapid, horrifying minutes. Thomas turned his attention then to his father's girlfriend. She ran back toward the bedroom to escape. She sought to call emergency services, but the chaos of the night had ensured no one had a charged phone handy. She reached a device and tried to call, and Thomas attacked her. She survived the attack, but not without severe consequences. Surgeries, recovery, the loss of an eye. It was a brutal, life-changing injury that everyone involved would carry forever. When the family finally reached the house, the mother and sister, frantic after the drive back, pounding the door and hearing shouting from inside, they called the police. Officers arrived quickly, puncturing the thick fog of adrenaline and terror that had blanketed the neighborhood. Thomas was taken into custody. In the aftermath, police pieced together the events from shaking witnesses, basement friends, the mushrooms, the panic, the run, the broken car window, the entry into the father's house, and the attack. At the police station and in the courtroom later, the narrative split into neat forensic fragments. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had committed a violent act. The defense leaned on a different explanation, that Thomas's brain had been changed by years of concussions, that the mushrooms had interacted with that damaged brain to create a psychotic break, that mental illness, not malice, had been the principal actor that night. It's the kind of argument that complicates the idea of justice. People want answers that are simple and clean, but life rarely obliges. News outlets picked up the story with the kind of breathless fascination that fuels headlines. Comment sections filled with questions and judgment. People wanted to know how a son could attack a father, how a young Pease could descend into violence, and what role drugs and injuries played. For the family, it was a private horror made public. A father gone, a mother and sister left to reconstruct their lives around a crime scene that had once been their living room. In court, jurors heard medical testimony about concussions and long-term neurotrauma. They heard about the mushrooms, risky in their own right, but rarely implicated in such extreme acts of violence. They heard from friends who witnessed the night spiral out of control and who spoke of Thomas's unpredictable behavior after the drugs took hold. They heard the father's girlfriend describe, in halting, strong speech, the moment everything changed, the moment a person she knew became a violent stranger. After the trial, Thomas was convicted of manslaughter and handed a 5-year sentence. The judge's bench adopted the language of consequence while the defense continued to appeal, arguing that Thomas's mental state and medical history should mitigate the penalties. Appeals dragged on, stretching months into years. In the meantime, the survivor of the attack underwent surgeries and a painfully long recovery, losing an eye and gaining a scar that would not only mark her face, but would also remain as a witness to the damage that night inflicted. When a legal resolution finally appeared, it was never neat. Some in the community felt justice had been served, others felt the system had not done enough to address the root causes: untreated head injuries, ease of access to drugs, a culture that doesn't ask the right medical questions after repeated concussions. For the family, the victory of a guilty verdict did not bring back what was lost. It could not reassemble the ordinary things that make up life, the holidays, the shared meals, the small rituals. Those were broken in a way that couldn't be unbroken. There's a scene that everyone who watched from outside wanted to understand: how a quiet night with friends could produce an act that would end a life and maim another. The answer is a braided one: part biology, part substance, part brittle mental health, and part the unpredictable lightning strike of a human mind that misfires at the worst possible moment. Thomas came into that house with a history of blows to the head and left with an indelible act on his record. That he thought he was God in those moments is the kind of detail that makes people search for meaning in a meaningless event. They want a single cause, a single villain, an answer that convinces them the world is orderly. But human tragedy rarely conforms to tidy narratives. When Thomas left prison, after appeals and legal wrangling, people in the community argued about whether he should be allowed to return to normal life. For newspapers and internet comments, the debate offered moral clarity. For a family, it offered a set of impossible choices: how to live with someone who had once been a child, then a son, then a defendant. The survivor of the assault made cautious, gradual steps into recovery. The mother and sister learned to live with the memory of the day that cleaved their lives in two. And Thomas, he re-entered a world that had been changed while he was inside, a world full of faces who remembered him as both son and accused, prodigal and perpetrator. There's an inevitable cultural aftertaste to stories like this: a social headline about drugs, a medical debate about concussions, a legal argument about culpability. But at the core is the human wreckage: a father dead, a woman permanently injured, a family remade around grief and disbelief, a young man whose life was rewrote, perhaps by choices, perhaps by chance, perhaps by a brain that could no longer reliably tell reality from hallucination. If there's any single lesson here, it's the fragile way our bodies and minds are stitched together. A series of concussions that might have looked like nothing more than a concussion when they happened can later look like a map toward catastrophe. Add something like a high dose of hallucinogens, and a brittle mind, and the result can be terrifyingly unpredictable. This was not a movie. There were no special effects or spectral metaphors to soften what happened. There were only the messy, human consequences: a mother who lost her partner, a survivor whose face bears the permanent reminders, and a young man who will carry a legal mark for the rest of his life. We don't tell it to moralize, and we don't tell it to sensationalize. We tell it because it matters that we do. Stories like Thomas's are warnings and also invitations. Warnings about the real risks of substances interacting with damaged brains. Invitations to look more closely at how we treat head injuries and mental health. They demand that we pay attention to the ordinary facts that can become extraordinary in the blink of an eye. A sports injury that seemed harmless at the time. A decision to take more of a substance because you aren't feeling it. A family asleep on a winter night. In the quiet months after the trial, the family learned what every family learns after a violent event: how to go on. They started small: dishes done in silence, the rituals of daily life, anniversaries observed with a hollow space where the father had once been. They marked the father's absence and the survivor's recovery with private rituals rather than public pageantry. Sometimes healing is small and private and incremental. Sometimes it is not healing at all, but the slow work of arranging life around an absence so vast it can be exhausting. And Thomas, whether seen as monster, patient or both, remained a person of earlier tenderness and later horror. He would have counselors, lawyers and doctors. He would not have back what he had destroyed. His story pulled at the broader threads: how sports culture often neglects brain health, how late-night decision-making becomes a key detail in an irreversible chain of events, and how the justice system struggles with the question of culpability when mental health and substance use are so tightly interwoven. When we end this chapter, it's not with a tidy moral or a definitive answer. It's with the sense that life is precarious and that the decisions we make in jest, in boredom, or in desperation can collide with factors we don't fully understand. The next chapter will not fix what's broken, but it might help us see how it all fits together. The concussions, the mushrooms, the moment Thomas believed himself to be a god, and the horrifying consequences that followed. If you're listening and you're thinking of this as a cautionary tale, you're not wrong. But don't reduce it to a line: "Don't take drugs," or "Concussions are dangerous." Those lines are true, but insufficient. The real takeaway is messier. Pay attention when someone's behavior changes. Take head injuries seriously. Be careful with substances, and know that the consequences of a single night can ripple outward in permanent ways. This is Thomas's story. A young man who went from being a rugby player boy to someone whose next act would reshape several lives forever. We tell it now so the quiet pieces, the small overlooked facts, might be seen before someone else stumbles into the same dark place.